Hello again, Mum. Robin here. Chapter 4 this time. This one's called First Times. And if you look, it looks as if I've got a halo above my head. There you go. Maybe I should try and hide that. Okay, First Times. This is Chapter 4. Grandma has already written about her first flight, but there were other times in her life about which she would like to tell, and which occurred many times before that flight. Her first visit to the theatre was one of these. It seems incredible that her parents took her at the age of only 9 to see one of the leading actors on the English theatre, Sir Beerbon Tree, in Shakespeare's Henry VIII. They had decided that even at such an early age she would retain some of the magic of such great acting in one of the world's great plays. Today, after 70 years, Grandma can assert that although she retained very little of the magic, that little was and still is strikingly vivid. First, there were the lights going out and the curtain going up, with darkness on one side and a brilliant scene on the other. Then there was the huge man in the long scarlet robe, Archbishop Wolsey, walking slowly and dignified across the stage, holding in his hand a little egg-shaped object, which he raised every once in a while to his nose. She learned later that this was a pomander. It was fascinating that Wolsey was never on stage without it. The next time that Grandma was taken to the theatre was, she is almost certain, also in London, and at about the same time. This was to see Joseph and his brethren. Much easier for a child to follow, especially since she already knew the story and much better remembered. Brightly coloured scenes of Joseph receiving the coat of many colours from his father Jacob, and of joining his brothers amid palm trees on the caravan route to Egypt, are still vivid in Grandma's mind. The next first time going to the pictures was in summer of 1914 in Newport, Rhode Island. Since this was in the USA, it was called going to the movies. Her memory of this occasion is vague, except for the fact that she was in quite a large group of children, not school, and that it was in a hall or theatre, and that a film about wild animals was shown. Not fierce, fighting ones, but animals in their habitat, a kind of nature film. She believes it was an Ernest Thompson Seton picture. Of course, it was black and white, and not a very exciting recollection, though interesting to Grandma as a precursor of many, many films seen over the years. Also before the first flight was the first dance. It must be understood that Grandma, as a girl in her teens, was very young for her age. When she was 16 and 17, she enjoyed two things at the seashore. One was swimming, the other was digging and building in the sand. She didn't know any boys except Lee Page, who, with his mother, stayed at the same pension in Paris as Grandma and her mother Croak. I think she writes about that later. Lee was just as queer in his way as Grandma was in hers. After Croak had yielded to Grandma's pleas to be allowed to spend most of her final school year in Paris, studying for matriculation exams, which she had to sit in America, and after 2 terms had been spent trying against great odds to achieve the requisite academic standard, Croak finally said, "Enough. You're going back to school for the last term." Before they went, Croak arranged to have some new clothes made. In those days on the continent, one rarely bought dresses, coats, and suits off the peg. One went to a dressmaker or to one of the couturiers. No, what's that? My ability to do this is rubbish. Couturiers. Anyway, bespoke dressmakers. Croak took Grandma to one of the smaller and less expensive ones. Haute couture, that stuff, anyway. While she herself went to one of the better-known ones. One of the dresses made for Grandma was a ball dress pour jeune fille, in an unbecoming colour, chosen, of course, by Grandma. Oops. Deep peach or apricot trimmed with silver. Quite soon after getting home, which was at that time a residential hotel called Haverford Court, but a mile from the Bryn Mawr house, to which the Wiles family had moved in 1914, there came an opportunity to wear it. One of her school friends had a brother called Howard, who invited Grandma to a dance. It was a posh affair in Philadelphia, and Grandma was overwhelmed by terror. As before, she said she knew no boys, even Howard she hadn't seen in years and didn't know well. It was not the custom in those days, at least not in America, for dancers to have programs or cards on, which to write the name of one's partner for each dance. So for the first dance, it was Howard. The second, with the boy introduced by him. The third, with the boy to whom the second one passed her on, and so on, and so on. Grandma was in agony. Poor thing. Physical agony, because dancing was always painful to her legs and flat feet, and mental agony because she was a bad dancer and didn't know what to say to these boys, all of whom appeared to be so sophisticated. They terrified her, all except Howard, who was, after all, only Dora's brother, with whom she had played jacks. To make matters worse, in America, the practice of cutting in prevailed, and while it gave popular girls a whirl, it caused misery for the plain and not popular ones. Grandma was most certainly not popular, and even the Parisian ball gown in apricot and silver could not transform her plainness. Oh, she's so down on herself, Mum. Nobody except Howard cut in on her that night, and he told her that she had danced too long with Nick. She replied that this was true, but what could she have done about it? Howard explained that in such a case a girl excused herself to go to the cloakroom. Grandma was learning the hard way and was delighted when it was time to go home. No more dances for a long time. I'll just take a break here. Gosh, I wish you could see this rain out here, Mum. I think I've had some thunder just recently, but it's just tipping down. The street outside Farrell's window is awash. In fact, I'm a bit worried about the neighbour's house getting his garage being flooded. Anyway, let's hope it stops soon. Good. Right, onward with this. So, the school where Grandma met Howard's sister Dora was the first she ever attended, although she was no longer there at the time of the dance. Surely one's first day at school couldn't have been so extraordinary as to be noteworthy, but Grandma's first day was, by most criteria, extraordinary. For a start, she was, as said before, 10 years old. It wasn't a case of having to go to school because one had reached a certain age, but a case of having to compete with other prospective pupils for the only available place. This was a most unusual school, being run by the Department of Education of Bryn Mawr College, a university college, at that time women only. It was, moreover, an outdoor school. The president of the college had a theory that if the open air was healthy for those afflicted with tuberculosis, it should be beneficial also to the children in good health. On a visit to Japan, she had determined that Japanese-style pagodas, with all four sides of glass, on three sides sliding windows, on one sliding doors, would make the most suitable classrooms. Hence, in the year the school opened, such a pagoda was built in the grounds, empty up to now except for one old and conventional building which housed administration, kitchen and dining room, locker rooms, music and eurythmic room and art room. The first class to be admitted, Class 1, was the lowest and was limited to 8 members. In the second year, a second pagoda was erected and Class 1 moved into it, becoming Class 2. It was in this year that Grandma started her schooling. There being only one place available in the new class, I and the Professor of Greek wanted to enter his daughter, Audrey. The headmistress decided to choose whichever child, Audrey or Janet, should do best in a test that she would set. There was another thunderclap. Since this proved to be Janet, it wasn't really a test of ability or knowledge. Grandma entered Class 1 of the Phoebe Anna Thorne Open Air Model School for Girls, Model School for short. Ultimately, there were to be 8 classes and 8 pagodas, the 8th one being the last year before matriculation. Actually, lack of space precluded the building of so many. The second one was a double one, and the third a triple one. At the end of 5 years, Grandma, to her distress, was sent away to boarding school. I know how she feels. When she returned to Bryn Mawr as an undergraduate, the pagodas had disappeared, the school having been moved to another site with conventional buildings. Grandma learned later that the Department of Education, after the retirement of the president, had decided to be governed no longer by her theories. The school staff were also remarkable for being young members of the academic staff of the college, some of whom eventually became professors of distinction. Such was the case with the Latin and French teachers. The history teacher became the headmistress of a school. The headmistress, a brilliant woman who taught English, is the one that Grandma remembers best on her first day. She explained to the pupils how important it was to handle books the right way and demonstrated the correct manner in which to open a new book. The benefit to the children of being taught by women such as these was inestimable. Grandma's love of Latin began then, in her second year, under the direction of the Latin mistress. The class acted Pyramus and Thisbe as part of the Latin lesson, the theory being that Latin should be taught like a modern language. The first sentence of the first Latin reader was Quam bella est mora maritima. I wish I knew what that means. Something about the sea, I think. Grammar had to be learned, but although of primary importance, it took secondary place in the initial stage of learning. Another break. It is taking Grandma a long time to get to the events of the first day at school, because it would be difficult to understand them unless one understood the unusual nature of the school. Members of the new class were introduced on arrival to Miss Beckley, the secretary, who showed them around, taking them first to the locker room in the basement, where each one was given one of the canvas cubicles, of which there were 2 rows. They weren't real lockers, but just like changing rooms at swimming baths, with a wooden seat across the back and some hooks at the sides. Oh, right. On one of these hooks hung a 2-piece Eskimo suit, trousers and jacket with a pointed hood, of blanket material, some in dull blue, some in a kind of tan. Miss Beckley said that these would not be needed until the weather got cooler. It was then late September or early October. She also showed the children where the heavy canvas-backed blankets were stowed. These would be required right away during naps after lunch. But before lunch, there was a break midway through the morning. This was called recess, during which milk and plain biscuits were served and a period of play enjoyed. The favourite games being dodgeball, capturing, and still pond no moving. Still pond no moving. I guess that sounds a bit Japanese. Lunch was at small tables. Grandma can't remember whether or not she could choose where she would sit, but she does remember that lunch was good and that it was served by a black maid. After lunch, the whole school went to the very wide covered wooden veranda, which ran around 2 sides of the building. On one side were stacked the canvas cots, the legs which folded under them like army cots. Each child took one, set it up, fetched a blanket, which was arranged on the cot and lay down. Probably on the first day, it being still early autumn, the blanket was not used. Nap lasted half an hour, during which one of the staff paced up and down to ensure there was no talking. After children fell asleep, just as a result of lying relaxed and quiet. Oh yes, that's what they did. Often children did fall asleep, just as a result of lying and relaxed and quiet. The blankets and flaps to fold up over the feet, and a flap on either side to fold over the body. Tapes were tied to keep the flaps in place. Sounds a bit restrained. After nap, each child folded her cot and blanket and stored them in the proper places. Before the end of the school day, milk and biscuits were again served. Even on the coldest days, Grandma doesn't remember feeling cold at nap or in the pagoda, for when it was very cold, the Eskimo suits plus blankets kept one warm, the suits being loose and bulky and fitting over other clothing. One could sit at one's desk, tied cosily into one's blanket, and when one had to get up to recite or read, one clutched it and hopped as though in a sack race. The days were well broken up by having to go into the main building for music, eurythmics, or art, for recess and lunch, and by the periods being short, so that one didn't have to sit in the cold for hours on end. Do you know, I'm just thinking about it because of current situation with the emergency, the pandemic. Do you know, it'd be quite good to be outside as much as possible. The 5 years spent at the model school were very happy ones for Grandma. Her 2 closest friends, Margaret and Dora, always kept in touch with her. Dora died around 1980. Margaret and her husband, Carl Villas, would have come to visit the boys in the summer of 1986 had Carl not been seriously ill. Margaret died in 1995, a few years after Carl. And that ends chapter 4. Well done, Mum. Good. Hope you're well. Speak soon. Bye-bye. Still pouring with rain, by the way. Still flooding out there. Speak soon.